please stand for the jury?
I will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. You may continue.
Thank you, Honor. Ms. LaViolette, I forgot to ask you one thing about the woman named Chriselle. Was she married?
Yes, she was.
Is that part of what put her in a vulnerable position?
Yes, it is.
All right, I want to talk to you about, we know that the last we hear from Ms. Arias through her journals on June 1st is that Mr. Alexander was guilting her about not seeing him. Is that right?
Yes.
At some point on June 3rd, are you aware of them having at least one conversation where he is guilting her again?
Yes.
And during that conversation, was Ms. Arias able to say no?
No.
So at some point then, does she then go to Mesa to visit Mr. Alexander?
Yes, she does.
As far as your understanding goes, what happens when she arrives?
She arrives very early in the morning. They go to bed and sleep for a little while. They get up, and there's rope. Apparently, they have done this one time before where he ties her to the bed, and it is with twine, and so that was uncomfortable, so they bought rope, or he bought rope. He ties her hands to the bed. They have sex. Then there are pictures taken of her genitals. After the pictures are taken, I believe that she goes to shower, and after she showers, they're going to look at CDs of the trips that they've taken, and the first CD that she pulls out, or the CD is scratched or won't play, and that Mr. Alexander gets very upset and throws it. And then he bends her over the desk, and they have sex again. It's rougher this time, but she says it's still consensual.
Is that something that she would rather do than face anger from him?
It's something she has consistently done to quell his anger.
Okay.
After that, he goes into the shower and wants her to take some pictures of him because he's been working out and he's kind of proud of the way his body is looking. And she drops the camera, and he gets very upset because she drops the camera, and says that a kindergartner can take better pictures, or 5-year-olds could do this better, and apparently comes out of the shower, body slams her. She falls to the ground. She wriggles away and runs into the closet, gets the gun that he has in the closet, and he comes after her again and is coming at her like a football player, and she does not believe the gun's loaded, but she points it at him and shoots. And after that, she really doesn't remember anything until she gets to Hoover Dam.
And just to put this in perspective, your evaluation of this case has to do with their relationship really leading up to this point. Is that right?
Yes, it really does.
Okay. And so any specific facts as far as what the specificity of what happens on that day, is that important to you, more important to you than the context of their relationship altogether?
No, I was retained on this case to look at whether or not I believe there was domestic violence that had occurred in their relationship. And that's really specifically what I was supposed to do, and that's what I did.
Okay. Do you have in your time that you've worked with battered women, do you have any experience in how they cope with trauma?
Yes, I do.
What is that?
Well, there are different ways that they cope with trauma, but one of the things that happens is that they can repress things. They can block memories. They can block painful things in their relationships. They minimize, they deny. Sometimes they find things to distract themselves. It really depends on every relationship or every person who's battered. Every survivor is different. And so they use different things, but a number of women will block out painful memories. A number of women minimize and deny in the relationship. There's a pattern for most battered women that they empathize with the person who hurts them. And that the bottom lines are dropping a little at a time. And as the bottom lines are dropping and as the self-esteem is dropping, then you also begin to see that the apprehension is usually going up at that point.
The apprehension for the woman?
Yes, the apprehension for the survivor in regard to the perpetrator.
Okay. Have you ever noticed in your counseling with battered women, do they ever detach from the trauma that they're experiencing?
Yes, they often detach because the memories are very painful. So they can look removed. And in fact, what I've seen, because sometimes we'll have battered women come out and tell their stories when we do public speaking or in training or that sort of thing. And when they have to tell their stories very much, initially, when they begin to tell their stories, there's generally a lot of emotion, or when they begin to feel that. But as they talk about the story and they tell it, they begin to detach from all of that feeling that was generated at the beginning. I think in part because it's too painful, and in part because they want to heal, and in part because the more you tell something, the more rote it gets in effect.
All right. Have you seen any of that with Jodi?
Yes, I have. And
how?
Well, with Jodi, I think that at the end of that relationship and toward the end of the relationship, she was really in touch with her shame. She was getting in touch with how bad she felt about herself, about the shame about what she was doing, and she was becoming very aware of that, and she talks about that. There's conversation about that with Mr. Alexander. And what happened was that she wrote things that she never thought anybody would see. She took pictures she never thought anybody would see, and that her shame is now public. And I'm not sure what any human being would do if their most private thoughts and their genitalia were made public consumption. And that's what's happened with this, with social media and everything. And I'm not sure how you hold up under that. I'm not sure what you do to hold up under that and how you do that without becoming somewhat detached to be able to do it.
What you've learned, what Jodi has told you about what happened on June 4th, and she talks about Mr. Alexander attacking her from the shower and being full of rage. Does that correlate at all with anything that you've seen in the escalation leading up to June 4th?
Objection. Previous court's order. Speculation. Approach.
Ms. LaViolette, when we were talking about escalation and the things that you see through reading his own words in April and May and the physical abuse, all that escalation and the fear that you talked about that abusive men have about their partner leaving, is there any correlation between that and the ability for Mr. Alexander to be rageful?
Yes, there is a correlation between those two things. There's definitely a correlation.
Can you explain the correlation?
The correlation is that fear is an emotion that is fear and powerlessness about the situation, escalate anger. And when I've spoken to many of the men in my program, one of the things we do some exercises on powerlessness because that's where a lot of it comes from, and that's what they talk about. They talk about the powerlessness that they feel. And so we talk about power in a non-hierarchical way. We talk about power, the power of making decisions as a group, the power of moving your agenda along without hurting anybody else, the power of feeling good, the power of an apology is one of the things that people will do, the kind of apology that's a gift, where you don't want anything from somebody else, where you're really, how strong you can feel with that. And so the men talk about a lot of those things, about how they feel about different kinds of power. And, they're pretty incredible conversations, actually.
And when they lose that power, is that something that results in fear and ultimately anger and rage?
Yes.
What about the idea that it takes two to tango? In other words, that it takes two to make an argument. Do you see that in these abusive relationships?
Well, if you're in a pretty healthy relationship, it takes two to tango. But if you're in an abusive relationship, you can tango with one person. And, that often comes up as a subject, that it takes two to tango. But as I read the instant messages, what you hear is it really doesn't particularly matter what Ms. Arias does. Mr. Alexander is still able to continue. And I see that a lot when somebody's on a roll and they're really upset. It sort of doesn't matter what the other person does. They can be quiet and that can escalate. They can say something smart-alecky and it can escalate. They can say something calming and it can escalate. So when you're in an abusive relationship, the two to tango rule sort of falls to the wayside.
All right. Given everything that you have reviewed, that you've read in this case, that you've seen, do you have an opinion, an ultimate opinion in your expertise about whether or not Ms. Arias was in an abusive relationship?
Yes, I believe she was in an abusive relationship.
And do you believe, in your expert opinion, that Jodi was a battered woman, or is a battered woman?
Yes, I do.
And is there a difference between isolated acts of aggression versus a pattern of aggression?
Yes, isolated acts of aggression, where actually anybody's capable of an isolated act of aggression. And many people have, found themselves, having an isolated act of aggression. The patterns is what makes it different.
Okay.
The pattern of and the context that it occurs in. So it's not just about physical abuse, it's about the emotional abuse. It's about the way somebody begins to feel about themselves. It's about the development of chronic apprehension.
All right, and so when you're talking about patterns and ultimately saying that Jodi is a battered woman, do you look at these patterns to make that determination?
Yes, I do.
And is that what you've seen here?
That's what I've seen in this relationship.
I want to ask you why. What do you base this on? And I'm going to put up Exhibit 558, which is the continuum that we talked about when you first took the stand. I want to ask you why. Why do you say that Jodi's a battered woman?
Well, nobody fits in a linear column.
Okay.
Human beings don't. So there are different kinds of things that happen in this relationship. Certainly putting down friends and family. There's some destruction of property, but it seems minimal at this point. A change in the victim's personality. Jodi is described by her two prior intimate relationships as generally happy, sweet, creative, lots of different things that are positive. They also say she can be a pain in the butt, which I'm sure that any of us can be a pain in the butt in a relationship. But what you begin to see is her moving into more depression, moving into more self-blame. They had talked about her as being good with other people. You see her pulling away from other relationships over time. So there's a lot of change in who she is. You see definitely threats of abandonment.
Where are you looking? I see you're looking up at the...
I'm looking at abuse and battering.
Okay, between abuse and a battering?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I'm looking at character assassination, because character assassination, and I don't even think I have it up there, do I?
But I see that under abuse you have name calling but not character assassination, right?
Yeah.
And then character assassination, you've told us earlier, is worse.
Yes.
And
So
more
I would
severe.
put character assassination in more high-end battering relationship.
Okay, a high-end battering relationship?
Yes, and you've got, for a period of time with Ms. Arias, you've got the monopolization of perception, where she tends to see the world through his eyes as opposed to her own. And you see manipulation. I mean, I don't have everything up there.
Right.
And that's just a guideline. It's just a framework. If you look at, Dan Sonkin's work, he goes into a lot more detail than I do.
Okay. Well, and that's what we talked about earlier, right? That no one human is going to exactly fit into one category, right?
Right.
Okay. But does this give us an idea of what a battering relationship might look like or a terrorist relationship might look like?
Yeah, I don't think that, there are definitely things that are higher in battering. I don't think terrorism tends to include a lot more violation of other laws, that kind of thing. So it tends to be the smallest percentage of people who are abusive.
Right. Okay. What about do you see psychological and emotional abuse?
Yes, I do.
And do you see, and part of that is the greater or the more severe character assassination?
Right.
What about physical abuse?
Well, there's an escalation in physical abuse, so you wouldn't be seeing, for instance, when you're looking at lower level abuse, you don't see choking. You don't see more frequent incidents. You usually, when you're looking at lower level abuse, and I say that not out of disrespect to people in that category, in the victims in that category, because they can have very low level abuse and still have very high levels of fear. So it's not about the level of fear, it's more about the behavior that's part of that. And the behavior that's part of that tends to be lower level kinds of physical abuse, which would be pushing and hitting, and lower level injury, which might be a bruise or a contusion, something like that. But choking is considered high end. So is breaking a finger. Kicking is considered high end. So what you're seeing is physical abuse at a higher level. You're seeing definitely the character assassination at a higher level. You see manipulation. You see deception. You see chronic infidelity. I mean, there's a lot going on here.
All right.
And the other thing is, of course, the family of origin issues.
Okay, and we see that at the top of your continuum with the exacerbating factors, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that the family of origin you're talking about specific to Mr. Alexander's family.
Yes, I am.
Okay. Is this something that Jodi could have seen from the beginning?
No, you don't start out in an abusive relationship with an abusive relationship. And I think that's really important to understand, that the way this started was with Miss Arias meeting a very charming young man who was handsome, who wooed her, who got her address to be able to go from a friend to be able to go to an executive director's brunch or dinner, who was someone who made her feel very special. That's what people attach to at the beginning. They don't attach to, in general, they don't attach to somebody who's violent and doesn't treat them well. They attach to the best part of this human being. But what happens over time is that if you tend to be abusive, you're unable to maintain that. That beginning stage where you have all that big energy from being in love with someone, that tends to go down. And if you're a child who grows up in an abusive household, and the more abusive, there's a positive correlation there generally with how people react as adults. That child who is grown now becomes scared in an intimate relationship. I mean, intimate relationships are scary for people. Healthy people are scared in intimate relationships. So when you're dealing with somebody who's abusive, the emotional fear can be really debilitating for them. And that's what begins to take over. The fear, it's called sometimes chronic combat readiness, that these kids have been around violence enough that they're in a perpetual state of apprehension. And what happens is they develop what I would call an emotional reflex. So they're reactive. They're coming from a reactive place instead of a responsive place. And so over time, that's what you start to see. You start to see the person become abusive, even when they don't want to be.
All right. What about the information that you've used to make this assessment about Jodi and about the relationship between Jodi and Mr. Alexander? That information, is this all coming from either Jodi's mouth or from her journals?
No, not at all. I reviewed, I've got a box at home that's this big, and I've reviewed tapes from CBS 48 Hours Mystery. I reviewed IMs and text messages, and I don't know what the other things are. Emails. I reviewed small portions of Mr. Alexander's journal. I've reviewed some things that he's written, some of his writing about his family. I've reviewed the comments from between him and other women, and the events between and the IMs between Mr. Alexander and Jodi Arias. And I don't believe anyone provokes somebody to an ongoing pattern of violence.
What do you mean by that?
We are the experts in relationship, I think, of pushing each other's buttons. When you're in a relationship with somebody, you pretty much know how to get to them. But so there's provocation that happens in healthy and normal relationships. People provoke each other. The difference is that in an abusive relationship, nobody can provoke that pattern. That a pattern tends to go from relationship to relationship if the relationship is long enough and intimate enough. And that's what I've seen over time with the men in my group. If they're connected to the woman, and a lot of times that is sexual connection, intimate connection, there's more likelihood that they're going to act out.
You talked about long enough and intimate enough. So in speaking with specifically about Mr. Alexander, when he was dating Lisa Andrews, that went on for months. Does it make a difference with abusive relationships if he was never intimate with her versus being intimate with Jodi?
That makes a difference. The other thing that makes a difference is they were really only together for 8 months. When Miss Arias lived out of state, there was not a lot going on, and she lived out of state for about 8 months. So there was not as much intimate connection between her and Mr. Alexander until she moved back, because they lived in separate places. But with Lisa Andrews, what you saw was that they broke up 3 times in that 8-month period. There was some physical contact for sure, but there wasn't sexual intimacy. But it was a length of time that was not particularly significant either.
All right. So then would it surprise you if she didn't complain about Mr. Alexander being physically abusive with her?
Yeah, it would surprise me.
Maybe I asked a double negative.
Okay.
Would it be I don't know. How would you feel if Miss Andrews did not complain about physical abuse from Mr. Alexander?
That she did not complain about it?
Right.
I wouldn't find that unusual. And she did complain about other things and about the pressure and about the on her sexually. She did complain about him pushing on her boundaries. She did complain about him putting her down. She did complain about those things.
Okay. You talked a little bit about the difference, about the change in personality of Jodi. How do you know that she has a change? What information is it that you have in order to make that assessment?
I read the interviews with her two previous boyfriends. One was Matt McCartney, who she had about a 2-year relationship, and the other one was Daryl Brewer, who she had a 4-year relationship. And Daryl Brewer actually says he saw her change sort of before his eyes, from a very responsible person, a more outgoing, happy person, and she changed, and so he had descriptions of her and talked about that. So I read the way she was described by her other partners, and they had significant time with her, so I thought there was some accuracy with that. The other thing is that she still maintained friendships with both of them, and that usually says something positive. When relationships break up, oftentimes people, certainly for a period of time, aren't friendly with each other, or they don't have a friendship after that. But she maintained friendships with both of them, which is a positive thing.
All right. And based on your review of the case, did you learn about the changes that occurred with Jodi then after being with Mr. Alexander?
Yes, she became, they described her as bipolar, meaning that she went back and forth in her moods.
So not an actual diagnosis?
No, not a diagnosis. Okay. People say bipolar.
Okay.
Usually when people say bipolar, what they mean is she goes from one mood to another, and it looks like it's happening relatively quickly. And she was described as moody prior to that. But this was a more extreme change, and this was described more by Mr. Brewer.
Okay. And what about her depression and suicidal tendencies, those types of things? Is that something that changed for her after being with Mr. Alexander?
Yes. Neither Mr. McCartney nor Mr. Brewer described Jodi Arias as suicidal.
And what about any type of deep depression with her?
They describe her as generally happy, and they talk about her crying and that she can fluctuate in mood, but they don't talk about her having deep depression that I read.
Okay. And did they talk about, when you say crying, is that what happens when she gets upset, that she would cry?
Yes. Not an unusual response.
All right. Did either one of them ever describe her as a liar?
No.
I have a couple of additional questions for you. I know it was a couple days ago when we established that you sent books to Jodi, right?
Yes, I did.
And is that about 5 books that you sent to her?
I think I sent her 4 books and a magazine subscription.
Okay. And I guess I'll get this out of the way now. Do you have a memory problem?
No, I don't.
And do you have any feelings for Jodi such that it would impair your abilities to make an honest assessment about her as a battered woman or about her relationship with Mr. Alexander?
No, I don't.
In everything, the text messages, everything that you've reviewed in this case, and from Mr. Alexander's own words, did you ever hear about any patterns where Jodi was being physically abusive or aggressive with Mr. Alexander?
No, I did not.
Did you ever see any patterns of verbal abuse from Jodi to Mr. Alexander?
No, I did not.
Did you ever see any patterns of psychological abuse or controlling behavior by Jodi to Mr. Alexander?
No, I did not.
And did you ever see any evidence at all of jealousy from Jodi to Mr. Alexander?
No, I didn't.
All right, I have nothing further, Judge. Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Ma'am. Ma'am, one of the things that you told us earlier was that
You have a bachelor's degree, correct?
No, I have a master's degree.
Well, before that, you had to have a bachelor's degree, correct?
Yes, I did.
What year did you get your bachelor's degree?
1969.
And then after that, you did get the master's degree, right?
Yes, I did.
And what year was that?
1980.
So there was a span of time between the bachelor's and the master's degree, correct?
Yes, there was.
And ma'am, one of the things that you didn't tell us was that after the master's degree, you did not continue in your studies, did you?
I'm not sure what you mean.
You did not obtain a PhD, did you?
No, but I continued in studies.
So is it true that you did obtain a PhD then?
No, I continued in my studies. I took classes and I take CEUs every year.
So the answer is no, you do not have a PhD, correct?
No, I don't have a PhD.
And since you don't have a PhD, ma'am, there are certain restrictions that are placed on you that are not placed on an individual with a PhD, correct?
Yes,
For example, you cannot administer any tests, correct?
I don't administer tests.
The answer is no then, correct?
Yes,
And the other thing that you can't do is you can't read any psychological test either, correct?
I can't read any
In
psychological
other
tests.
words, you may have some training in what you do, but in terms of looking at a psychological test, you may have some idea, but you have to rely on others that have more schooling and training than you to be able to tell you what the results are of a particular test, right?
I would tell you that we have different training. And in terms of psychological tests, I would not be doing psychological tests. In terms of other things, I might have more training than someone with a PhD.
I'm not asking about other areas. I'm talking about psychological tests. Do we understand each other?
We definitely understand each other.
With regard to the psychological testing, it's true that you do not have the expertise to be able to engage, if you will, in the reading of tests, correct?
Correct.
And you can't score tests, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, you're aware of what is known as the DSM-4, right?
Yes, I am.
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychologists and sometimes psychiatrists use in diagnosing individuals, correct?
Actually, that's not correct.
There is no such book as a DSM-4?
Psychotherapists also use that book, and I am a psychotherapist, Mr. Martinez.
So you do use that book then, right?
I've used that book.
And with regard to this particular case, isn't it true that in that book that you say that you use and that you are familiar with, isn't it true that in that book there is no diagnosis of battered woman, right?
True.
There is no indication or any diagnosis of an abused woman either, correct?
Objection, Judge. May we approach?
Yes. May continue. Overruled.
With regard to the DSM-4, isn't it true that it does not have a diagnosis of quote-unquote battered woman, right?
True.
And now, what we really have in this particular field is what you do, correct? You have somebody who has experience, right?
Well, I want to hear what you're talking about. Can
Do
you
you
tell
or do you
me?
not have experience in dealing with what you allege to be battered women?
I do.
And with regard to that experience and making a determination whether or not an individual is a battered woman, basically what you have available to you are clinical interviews, right?
That's one thing that we have available.
Right, and basically a clinical interview is you sitting across from the person that may or may not be a victim of battering and talking to them, right?
That's one of the things I use.
Right, that's what you do, right?
That's one of the things I do.
That's one of your main instruments, if you will, in trying to determine whether or not the situation
It is
involved.
not my main instrument, Mr. Martinez.
Is it one of the items that you use?
It is one of the things that I use, correct.
And in this particular case, you told us that what? You spent, 40 hours talking to the defendant?
44.
44 hours, so that's the clinical interview aspect of it, correct?
I used that as that is the clinical interview that I did, right.
Yes or no? That is the clinical aspect of your practice, correct?
It is a clinical aspect of my practice.
And in this case, the 44 hours, that's the clinical aspect of this evaluation, right?
I'm not sure what you mean by the clinical aspect.
Well, a clinical interview, as you know what a clinical interview is, right?
Of course I know what a clinical interview
All right,
is.
then we seem to be having problems with it. With regard to a clinical interview, ma'am, isn't that a situation where you sit across from an individual and you talk to them about the issue that is at hand? Isn't that true?
You interview them, you ask questions, You do an assessment.
So when you are interviewing, you're not talking then, right?
Mr. Martinez, I
Yes or
think...
no? My question is, are you talking yes or no?
Mr. Martinez, are you angry at me?
Ma'am, is that relevant to you? Is that important to you?
Ladies and gentlemen, please refrain from laughing in the courtroom.
Is that important to you whether or not the prosecutor is angry to you with regard to your evaluation? Does that make any difference to your evaluation whether or not the prosecutor is angry? Yes or no?
Objection, Judge. Compound question.
It makes a difference to me the way I'm spoken to, and I would like you to speak to me the way I speak to you.
Ma'am, is it true that just because the prosecutor is angry at you, is that going to make you change your answer with regard to whether or not this is a battering situation?
No, certainly
Well,
not.
then, the fact that the prosecutor may or may not, or you may perceive him as being angry, that really has nothing to do with your evaluation, does it?
No, but it certainly is.
Yes or no? Does it have anything to do with your evaluation? And judge, it's a yes or no answer.
Judge, she's trying to answer the question. Some of these questions cannot be answered by yes or no.
Ms. Lawler, can you answer that question, yes or no?
I'm not sure at this point what the question is, because when someone is approaching in that way, it's very hard to listen.
All right. Restate your question.
Just because somebody has a demeanor that you perceive to be angry, is that going to sway your opinion as to what you think in this case?
No, it isn't.
Is it going to change anything about your evaluation based on the way the questions are asked?
No.
So in this case, when we're talking about the interview, the clinical interview, what we're talking about you doing is speaking to the defendant across the table about the issues in this case, right?
Yes.
And that's the interview, speaking with each other. You spent 44 hours, right?
Yes.
The other thing that you indicated to us was that, well, you looked at a lot of other collateral items, right?
Yes.
You looked at journals, that's what you indicated, right?
One of the things I looked at.
Sure, and you indicated that you looked at writings of interviews with other people, right?
That I looked at.
Interviews that were done by somebody else.
Yes. Yes.
You looked at text messages, right?
Yes.
Instant messages, right?
Yes.
Emails, right?
Yes.
And that's how your evaluation was in this particular case, right?
That is correct.
You did not, other than talking to the defendant, you did not talk to anybody yourself, right?
That is correct.
So you were left, if you will, in terms of the materials that you were to review, not from the defendant, not about the journals, you were sort of left to just read what somebody else had written about an interview with a collateral source, right?
On those particular collateral sources. On the
Yes.
interview parts, certainly. Not on the IMs and the text.
I'm talking about the collateral sources that actually somebody wrote down a synopsis, right? Right? And one of the things that we know with regard to your particular approach is that since there is no diagnosis in the DSM-4, there really is no, if you will, guide out there to tell you when somebody is really a battered individual or if somebody is an abused individual, right?
That's not correct.
Well, what we actually have then is, let's take exhibit number 558. Isn't this what you used to tell us?
That was an example.
I'm not done my...
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Isn't
apologize.
this true, exhibit 558? Isn't that what you ended your testimony with, talking about this particular continuum of aggression and abuse to tell us that the defendant, in your opinion, was the victim of abuse, right?
That was not the only thing that I used, Mr.
Yes or
Martinez.
no? Did you use this to tell us that the defendant was in an abusive relationship? Yes or no?
Objection, Judge. She tried to answer the question. He interrupted her.
Overruled. You may answer.
Yes or no?
It's not a yes or no. Do you want the truth, Mr. Martinez, or do you want
Ma'am,
yes or
I'm
no?
asking you questions. You seem to be having trouble answering my questions.
I have trouble.
If you have a
Okay.
problem understanding the question, ask me that. If you want to, do you want to spar with me? Will that affect the way you view your testimony?
Argumentative.
Sustained.
We approach, Your Honor.
Yes.
With regard to this particular case, ma'am, you did refer to this exhibit 558. Yes or no?
I referred to it.
Yes or no?
Yes, I referred to it.
And when you referred to it, Ms. Wilmot was asking you questions about it, yes or no?
Yes.
And she was asking you questions about that, and it involved the defendant, didn't it?
Yes.
And it involved the defendant in your opinion as to whether or not she was somebody who was abused, correct?
Not exactly.
Well, is it somebody that was not abused then?
No, I
Yes or no?
don't rely particularly just on that, and it feels like that's what you're trying to get me to say.
Did you use this as
As one part?
Right. Isn't that what you used?
I used it as one piece of information.
And what happened is you went to the diary, the journals, for example, right? You reviewed the journals here,
I
right?
reviewed the journals.
And then you went to this, which is exhibit number 558, and then you started to talk about how something in the journal was mirrored or set out in exhibit 558, right?
Something in just the journal? I'm not sure what you're asking. Are you asking me if the only...
Let me ask it this way. Do you remember talking to us about a lot of journal entries? Do you remember talking to us about that?
Yes.
Do you remember talking about certain dates, right? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And do you remember talking about what was written in those journals, right?
Yes.
And you characterized what was written in those journals, right?
Some of
Sure.
what was written in the journal?
Yes, what was written in those journals, you characterized it, right?
Mr. Martinez, I'm not sure what you're saying.
With regard to the journals, do you remember talking about the journals?
I do.
Do you remember talking about specific dates in those journals, right?
I do.
And with regard to those journals, for example, with regard to the defendant, you indicated that she never said anything negative about Mr. Alexander, right?
Objection, mischaracterizes your testimony.
Oh, you may answer.
Do you remember saying that?
I said that I hadn't read anything that she said that was negative.
So if you didn't read anything that showed that there was anything negative, in your mind there was nothing negative in those journals about Mr. Alexander, right? As written by the defendant, right?
There were selections of those journals.
Right. The journals that you reviewed here in court, ma'am. All of the journal selections that you reviewed here in court. And you did review more than those journal selections here in court, right?
Yes.
You reviewed all of the journals, right?
Miss Arias's journals?
Sure, yes.
And during that period of time?
Yes, you reviewed
I
her
didn't
journals.
read all of her journals.
You read journals aside from the ones that were presented here in court, right?
Yes, I did.
So as a result of those reading of those journals, you then said to us, for example, well, there's nothing in those journals that is said by the defendant negative about the person that she killed, right?
No, that's not true.
Mischaracterizes your testimony.
Overruled. She's answered. Her answer will stand.
Okay? Tell me what negative things the defendant wrote about herself.
I thought you asked me if she said anything negative about Mr. Alexander.
Did you have a problem understanding the question? Tell me what negative things the defendant wrote about herself in those journals. That was my question.
Would you show me what you're referring to?
No, you're the one that just told us that you read journals before you came here into court, didn't you?
I did.
And you spent many hours, correct?
Yes, I did.
And you charged $250 an hour to read them, right?
The standard fee, Mr.
Am I asking if
Martinez.
that's a standard fee?
Apparently not.
And ma'am, and in those journals, the ones that you read, the ones that you can remember, can you think of anything negative that the defendant said about herself in those journals? Anything?
She talked about being depressed. She talked about, and there are numerous places where she talks about feeling bad about herself in places, not just in the journal, but in places.
I'm talking about the journals, ma'am. Remember, that's what we're talking about. Just the journals.
I read the journals.
Right. What else?
I read the journals, and you would have to show me specifically what you're talking about. I don't know what part of the journals you're talking about, and frankly, I read pages and pages of journals, Mr. Martinez.
I'm just talking about...
So when you're asking me to say something specific about what she said about herself, I had samples. Do you have samples to give me that I can see where...
I'm asking you from your reading of the journals, as you sit here today with the memory that you have intact, what can you tell us that she wrote that was negative You did say that you read the journals, right?
I did read the
Objection, argumentative, and foundation, date and time that he's referring to.
Overruled.
Right? You did say you read the journals, right?
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us that is negative that she wrote in any of those journals?
You're asking me specific comments she made, and I can't tell you specifically what she said because I don't have the journal with me.
Oh, so in order for you to tell us what she wrote in the journal, you have to have it in front of your face so that you can read it, right?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained. Rephrase.
Well, it seems to be what you're telling me is that your memory is lacking as to what was in those journals. Yes or no?
No.
All right, then give me another example of what you read in those journals that is negative that the defendant said.
She talks about not being productive.
Okay, what else?
She talks about feeling lousy about herself.
Okay.
She talks about not being advanced in PPL the way she'd like to be advanced in PPL. She talks about not having her goals, not forwarding her goals in the way she wants to.
Anything else?
I'm sure there are other things.
But you just can't remember right now, right?
I can't.
And all in all, what you've given us is a pretty positive picture of the defendant, because those kinds of things that you're talking about are really not that major in the grand scheme of things, are they?
They're not that major.
And ma'am, with regard to this issue of how you conduct your work, the way it really works is that you conduct the interviews and then you look at other sources, right?
I do.
And that's what you did in this case, with the exception that you only conducted one interview, right? The defendant's interview, right?
Yes.
And in this case, we are left, if you will, to follow this roadmap that you gave us, which is Exhibit 558. That is, in a sense, a roadmap, right?
It's a guideline.
It's a guideline, which means we can look at it to guide us to a goal, right?
It is a guideline. It is not a specific roadmap that will take you from here to here.
I'm not asking, I've left the word roadmap behind. I actually used the word guideline. Isn't this a guideline that will take us to a certain decision or opinion by you? Isn't this in part, isn't this a guideline that you used?
It is a guideline.
And this is a guideline that you created, right?
Yes, it is.
So that you can change it whenever you want, right?
I have changed it.
Right. So the answer is, this is your guideline and you can change it whenever you want, right?
Yes.
And in fact, with regard to using this guideline, isn't it true that you really don't even have to talk to any of the parties that are involved in order for you to reach your opinion?
I don't use a guideline that way, Mr. Martinez.
Well, are you familiar, back in 2010, are you familiar putting on a seminar and indicating that Snow White was a battered woman? Do you remember talking about that?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
Do you remember that? Yes or no?
No, that's, if you would like to show the entire YouTube video, I would be happy for anybody to see that, because I'm not talking, the title is Snow White, a Battered Woman, because it was catchy.
Right. So it does say, is Snow White a battered woman, right? That is the title of it, correct?
It is.
And in fact, you gave this presentation, if you will, in Las Vegas back in 2010, right?
I've given it more than once.
In 2010, isn't it true that you gave this presentation in Las Vegas?
I gave a short form of it.
Yes or no?
I gave a short form of it. Yes, I did.
Did I ask you whether it was a long, medium, or short form?
Well, there are different versions of it, Mr. Martinez.
I'm asking you whether or not you gave this presentation, yes or no. I'm not asking about the
I
length.
gave a presentation in Las Vegas. Yes, I did.
Isn't it true that you also gave that presentation in Los Angeles, again in 2010?
An altered version.
But you did give this presentation involving Snow White and whether or not she was a battered woman in Los Angeles, right?
Yes.
And one of the items that you used with regard to that in trying to determine whether or not an individual is a battered person, you look at 558. That's a guideline that you use, right?
I did not use that at all in any of the speaking engagements, Mr. Martinez.
I'm not asking if you used it in the speaking engagements. In this case, for example, you talked about family of origin issues. Do you see that up there?
Yes.
And one of the things that you told us, well, you looked at the family origin of Mr. Alexander. Didn't you tell us that?
Yes.
Well, if we take a look to follow up on your Snow White issue that you presented, isn't it true that she had family of origin issues, didn't she?
The family of origin issues we're talking about here, Mr. Martinez, are the family of origin issues for the perpetrator.
Okay. So, in other words, in this case, you see Mr. Alexander as the perpetrator. You don't see him as the victim.
No.
And so it's...
Well, I am looking at domestic violence. And in regard to domestic violence, I am seeing Mr. Alexander as the perpetrator. Yes.
And one of the things that we know about your presentation also is that, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm, right?
Yes.
And in it, we have an individual, that's the king, right, who is married and has a kid, and they name her Snow White, right? Yes or no?
I'm not using the Brothers Grimm version. I'm using the Walt Disney cartoon. I just want to make that clear.
So there's different, all right? But it is true, though, that Snow White had a father, right?
Yes, she did.
And the father was the king, right?
Yes.
And it ends up that Snow White's mother ends up dying, right?
Yes.
And what ends up happening is that he remarries, right?
Yes.
And what ends up happening when he remarries is that he has somebody who is less than honorable, if you will, or savory with regard to her view of Snow White, correct?
Yes.
And so what happens during that situation is that there is a problem because this woman, the queen, begins to, if you will, abuse or be less than nice to Snow White, right?
Yes.
So what we have then is a situation where we have a father who has failed to protect, right? If we're looking at it from this global perspective, right?
Yes.
And so then if we look at it that way, Snow White is sort of being, and I use the term loosely, abused. Not in the technical sense, but she's not being treated correctly, right?
She's being abused as a child, right?
That's correct. And one of the things that happens after that is that the father sends her away, correct? She goes into the forest, right?
Objection for relevance, going this far into the Snow White story?
Overruled.
Right?
She goes into the woods, correct.
And in fact, when she's out in the woods, there's neglect by the father, right?
Yes.
So, for example, in this particular case, one of the things that you used in your evaluation was that the defendant, according to you, suffered some abuse as a kid, right?
Yes.
According to you, the wicked stepmother in her circumstance is her mother, right?
I didn't say that.
No, I'm the one that's asking the question. Isn't that true?
I don't equate her mother with a wicked stepmother.
Well, her mother, according to what you found out, hit her with a spoon, right?
Right.
And according to what we know is she allowed her father to hit her also, right?
Yes, she did.
And her father hit her, and at one point, you know, some of this. What do you know about what her father did to her in terms of any abuse that there may be here?
There was one incident where he pushed her and she hit a piece of furniture and lost consciousness.
And the mother was present, right?
I'm not certain if the mother was present, Mr.
Wouldn't that
Martinez.
be important to know?
Not necessarily, because there were other incidents.
Pardon?
There were other incidents. I'm not evaluating whether or not Ms. Arias is a battered child, Mr. Martinez. I was looking at the issues of domestic violence.
Well, ma'am, you're talking about abuse, aren't you?
I'm
Right.
talking about domestic violence between two adult intimates.
And one of the things that you just told me that you did was that you looked at the background of the defendant. Didn't you just tell me that?
I did.
And you know about this abuse at the hands of her mother, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that happens, and we've talked about Snow White being sent out in the forest, one of the things that happens to the defendant, you're aware, is that according to what you know, isn't it true that before this she was the age of majority, she was, if you will, also sent out into the woods to go live with somebody else, right?
She was not sent out. She chose to leave.
So she left. In other words, she chose to leave. Why? Why do you believe that she chose to leave?
Objection, relevant speculation. It's very tough.
Overruled.
Go ahead. Why did she choose to leave?
She chose to leave because she felt abused and because she felt controlled.
By her parents, right?
Yes.
And she moved in with somebody by the name of what? What was his name?
Bobby Wattis.
And she lived in what can be best described as less than ideal circumstances, right?
Correct.
And the same thing with Snow White, right? She lived in a situation with less than ideal circumstances, right?
She lived with the seven dwarfs, and according to the Disney version, she was pretty happy.
Well, she lived in a shack, right?
I thought it was a cute little cottage, Mr. Martinez.
All right. But there's seven dwarfs that she's living with, right? No one of her own age is there, right?
I don't know the age of the dwarfs.
Well,
I don't. I'm sorry, but I don't.
What I'm saying to you is it your opinion that there were other little kids that would play in the playground with her when she was living with the seven dwarfs?
Objection, relevance. Argumentative.
Overruled. You may continue.
Would you repeat the question, please?
Is it your understanding that there were other little kids to play with Snow White out near the shack?
Near the cottage? No.
In fact, she was just there cooking and cleaning, right?
Well, she was talking to the birds and singing with the animals.
And cooking and cleaning for the dwarfs, right?
Correct.
Isn't that sort of what you know about the defendant and Bobby Juarez, right?
I don't know that Jodi Arias was cooking and cleaning for Bobby Juarez.
Do you know if he was working?
He was not working.
Do you know who was providing the money to buy the food?
They were living with his family.
Right, but do you know whether or not the defendant was working?
She was working.
Do you know whether or not she indicated on the stand that she was the one that bought all the food?
I've not been privy to what she said on the stand, Mr. Martinez.
Did you discuss it with her?
That she bought food and
Sure.
brought food into the house? Yes, she did.
And then with regard to Snow White, one of the things that we know is that something bad happens to her, right? The incident with the apple, right?
Yes.
Somebody comes and harms her, right?
Yes.
And we can take it different ways, but do you know any incident involving her and Bobby Juarez?
Yes.
What is the incident that you know about?
I know about a time that he choked her. I know that he, according to Mr. McCartney, verbally abused her.
So with regard to the choking, that's a violent act, correct?
Correct.
Just like this issue involving the apple is a violent act, right?
Correct.
And with regard to Snow White, we know that she ends up going unconscious, as we would talk about it in this day and age, right?
Correct.
And basically what's going on with her is that she's waiting around, right? For Prince Charming, right? Or somebody, right?
She's waiting around
Well, she's not going anywhere, right?
when she's unconscious?
Right.
Well, when she's unconscious, she's lying around unconscious.
Right. And then we have the kiss or whatever happens, and Snow White awakens, right?
Correct.
And she starts to live with Prince Charming, right?
Yes.
And if we start talking about this issue involving the balance of power, in that particular situation, Snow White has no power, right?
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
Right?
Well, she's a queen. I'm not sure what kind of power she has.
The king has the power, doesn't he?
Objection, foundation.
Relevance, foundation, speculation.
Overruled.
Right?
Well, the king, yes, has more power.
Right. And so if, for example, Snow White, in this relationship, if we're talking about the balance of power, in that case, she doesn't have much power, right?
Objection, speculation. Judge, may we approach?
You may approach. You may continue.
Based on your understanding, ma'am, who had the power in that relationship, the king or the queen?
In the specific cartoon of Snow White,
I'm talking about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, presentation, which you have used on 2 separate occasions.
Mr. Martinez, you're mischaracterizing my presentation. I don't do my presentation the way you're characterizing it.
Ma'am, isn't it true that there's a syllabus that indicates, for example, that from 11:10 to 12:10 in Studio 3, Alice Laviolette presented a presentation titled, Is Snow White a Battered Woman? Would that be true?
That's the title. It was a catchy title.
So is that yes? That would be true then, right?
It was a catchy title, yes.
So, yes, I am reading it correctly, right?
You're reading the title correctly. You're not reading the content correctly.
Ma'am, what this shows us is that with your approach and with Exhibit 558, even if no one's alive, even if it's a myth, even if it's all made up, you can still come to the opinion.
Wait till he finishes the question. Finish your question.
Isn't it true that you can still come to the opinion that the person in this fantastical world is a victim of domestic violence?
That is incorrect.
Well,
That was not what I said in my speech.
and
I have said repeatedly that it is a catchy title, and I used it. But what I do in the speech is to talk about gender and power, and I talk about gender, Mr. Martinez. I'm not talking about Snow White actually being a battered woman. I use, well, you'd have to see the speech
Ma'am,
and you'd have to see the content, Mr.
putting
Martinez.
aside your presentation, now we put aside your presentation, isn't it true that using your continuum of aggression and abuse, and by reading this myth, we can plug in and go through this and make an assessment that Snow White was a victim or was a battered woman? We can do that, can't we?
No, we cannot.
What?
We absolutely cannot.
There's an objection. Ms. Lamont.
That's a mischaracterization of the continuum. He called it a myth.
I think you misinterpreted the question. Restate your question.
Isn't it true, ma'am, that if we take a look at this continuum of aggression and abuse, which is Exhibit 558, if we use that and we refer to something that's wholly a myth, using your expertise, we can make a determination, for example, that Snow White was a battered woman, can't we?
No, we cannot.
Well, then let's talk a little bit about Snow White and whether or not we have some of these issues that are presented here.
We're
in your
talking-
exhibit. Yes or
that's-
no? Can we do that? Yes, can we do that? Could you do that with me?
You're mischaracterizing it, Mr. Martinez.
Overruled.
I would like to go through it with you. And what you've told us is that these columns are not necessarily exclusive, right?
That is specific to adult relationship, adult intimate partner relationship, Mr. Martinez, and I have no information about the relationship between Prince Charming and Snow White. I don't know what their relationship was, so you're mischaracterizing that by saying that that can be applied to Snow White as a child. This is not about child abuse.
Well, let's talk about, for example, whether or not we can find some of the items that were present in the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and whether or not Snow White was a battered woman, okay? With regard to the conference agenda, that conference agenda that we're talking about, it dealt with adults, didn't it?
It dealt with adults.
Yes, it did. And in it, you said, is Snow White a battered woman? That was the title, right?
Objection, ask the answer.
Sustained.
And that being the case, ma'am, now you're trying to tell me that, well, no. I don't want to talk about Snow White now because it involved a child, right?
No, that's not what I said, Mr.
Well,
Martinez.
then...
Do you want me to answer that, Mr. Martinez?
Yes, I want you to answer me why it is now that you don't want to talk about Snow White as an adult when you did talk about Snow White as an adult when you made the presentation back in 2010.
I talked about Snow White in regard to growing up and what we believe about ourselves as men and women growing up. I did not talk about Snow White in an intimate relationship with the prince.
What did you say at the end there? In an intimate relationship where?
With the prince or the king or whoever.
My question was a little bit more narrow than that. And my question was that in this presentation, this involved adults that you were talking about, right?
I spoke to adults.
And it involved adult abuse, didn't it?
It involved gender. We were talking about gender and expectation about gender. And it was in a domestic violence conference, so I spoke about it in a domestic violence conference.
Right, and it involved adults, right?
It involved what we learn as children and bring into adulthood.
So it involved what you learn as children and what now?
And what we can bring into adulthood about what we learn as children.
Right, and so for example, if we have anger as an issue in the family, that's something that we can learn as a child and take into adulthood, which is what you told us about Mr. Alexander, right?
Correct.
And so we can talk about a number of things that are here and use this as a guide, can't we? To determine whether or not there's an individual is a victim of abuse, right?
I'm confused. Are you talking about Snow White again? Because I'm not sure where you're going here.
I'm talking still about...
I'm not understanding this.
I'm talking about Snow White, Exhibit 558.
That is not applicable to Snow White and the prince's relationship, which is the relationship that this is about adult intimate partner violence. And you keep referring to Snow White as a child, and what I'm saying to you is that that's about adult intimate partner violence and not about her relationship with the prince, which I know nothing about after they get married.
So what you're saying is, though, even though this involved adults, and you did say is Snow White a battered woman, which would imply that she was involved with a man as an adult, right? You're saying that disregard that now, right? Because it doesn't mean what it says, right?
All right, we're going to take the recess at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, Monday, 9:30 a.m. Please remember the admonition. Are there any questions? Have a nice weekend. You are excused. The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Ms. Levelette, you may step down. Counsel, is there anything else for today?
Just the issue that we talked about that you would address in private.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said.
I said just the issue that the judge indicated she would address in private with Ms. Levelette.
Yes. Why don't we go back in the hallway? No.